Well, good morning and welcome, and thank you for joining with me again. We've been talking over the last couple of days about the importance of addressing people who are involved in a false doctrine, who are being contentious or being divisive. And where we left off, I was quoting out of Titus chapter 3, verse 10. Keep in mind, we're still in chapter 1, but Paul says to Titus, a man that is a heretic. In other words, a heretic is somebody, the word literally means causing a division, a severing, if you will. And he says, a man who is causing a severance and a cut to fellowship. He's dividing the church. He says, after the first and second admonition, reject him. In other words, you confront it. If they refuse to acknowledge that you're right, then the conversation should end right then. There's no reason to continue that out. And I don't think Paul is saying that, but he's using the principle of Matthew 18, where he says you first go to him as an individual, establishing the conversation with 2 or 3 witnesses. Then he secondly says that if he doesn't receive that, then you need to go back with other witnesses who can view what you're saying. And then finally, he said if they continue to reject it, you bring them up before the church, which implies the leadership of the church, not the entire congregation. I'm afraid that's a mistake that some churches have made. But essentially, he says, you're giving them 3 opportunities, but 3 strikes and you're out. And it shows that a person keeps on going back to that same argument, is pretty well wedded to that principle, and there's no way that you can change that. And the reason why he says that is, in a sense, we just need to care enough about people to confront them on issues like that. In fact, there was a book by a guy named David Augsburg, written probably 20-some years ago now, call it by that title, Caring Enough to Confront. It's really, as I recall, it was a very excellent book and very real challenge to me that when you see people who are caught up in error, you need to love them enough to be able to be willing to say that. If you see, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 6:1, he says, if you see your brother overtaken in a fault, go to him in a spirit of meekness, considering your own self. In other words, trying to understand where they're coming from based upon your experience, and then you can begin to correct them, to really help them to understand where they're going wrong. And it's the idea that we are confronting with empathy. Not antipathy, because a lot of times we confront people with antipathy. How dare you believe something or say something like that? In most cases, that's not required. I'm not saying there aren't times, but in most cases, it's not required. But he said, basically, if they keep on going back to that same false teaching, that same misconception, then you just need to call it to a halt. I found by experience, usually just a face-to-face honest conversation, me and that person alone, usually is enough to resolve any misunderstandings or miscommunications. One of the things I often encourage people to do is don't try to settle these things by the internet. Don't send emails back and forth, because my goodness, you see, people read emails and you assign all sorts of tones and emotions to what they've said, when in fact you may be completely misreading their response. So it's really important that you don't base your conclusions on reading of emails, which often is the case. But why is it important to confront these people when they do this stuff? Well, there's 3 real good reasons, and Paul brings them out. The first time he says, because they are ruining whole households by teaching things they ought not to teach. In other words, they're bringing in a confusion and a chaos, which really is an effort essentially to, as Paul said in Acts chapter 20, they're seeking to really draw disciples away from your leadership or your influence to get them to follow theirs. And that's what I find really interesting, is because these kind of what the Bible describes as false shepherds, and they don't have to be pastors, they can just be anybody you know who simply wants to get people to validate their sense of themselves by getting you to believe or trust in what they have to say. And you always know the way of a false shepherd. Eventually, at some point, he's going to just desert you someplace in the wilderness and go on, because all he really cares about is his own welfare and his own concerns. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood in saying this, but there's a reason why I've continued to pastor my church for the last 40 years. And I remember it was an old friend of mine, an English pastor by the name of Stanley Voke, who really exhorted me in my ministry. He said, the biggest mistake, he said, I ever made as a pastor was leaving my church that was doing quite well to take a promotion to a more important and bigger church. And he said, I had to start all over again. He said it was the biggest mistake I ever made. And I thought to myself at the time, I thought, well, here I am. I'm a young pastor. I'm trying to be faithful to the Lord and build this ministry. And it's really was about what Stanley told me. It's really about longevity. It's really about staying with it, because one of the things he described to me was really helpful. He says when a pastor leaves a church not because he has to, but because he has a better opportunity, he said emotionally it impacts a congregation the same way it is when a father leaves his wife and family for another wife and family. There's a sense of being divorced, being devalued. It's very heartbreaking. And so in a way, as a pastor, I'm kind of, my view has been till death do us part. And of course, I don't know when that day comes, but I know that God has this amazing way of having perfect timing. There's a wonderful symmetry to everything that God does. He doesn't deal with chaos and confusion. So here are these people he's talking about who are trying to bring in confusion and chaos into a fellowship, basically not concerned for what they're doing, but really just trying to get people to follow after them. And that's why Paul goes on to say, not only are they causing ruin, but the reason, he says, that for the sake of dishonest gain, they're doing it so that they can benefit. Now, we automatically think it's about money. And, most of the time it is about money. We often say, follow the money. But the simple fact is there are some people who are just greedy for attention. They're greedy to be viewed as being important and valuable. There are many people who will want to take your position, not because they want the position as much as they want what they think the position will do for them. It reminds me of a short story that I heard many, many years ago of a man who was in jail, and the cell next to him had a window, and the man would go up to the window and look out, and every day he'd tell him how beautiful it was, and the trees and the fields, painted this beautiful picture. And the other man, who had no window in his cell, became so jealous of that window that eventually he found out a way to really kill the other prisoner and then get himself transferred into his cell. And when he got into the other prisoner's cell that he had just assassinated, he pulled himself up to the window, and the window looked out on a brick wall. The man had been telling him all this stuff, just trying to encourage him. And see, he desired that position, but the position, once he got it, turned out not to be anything that was good. I found that in all of life, whether we're talking about ministry or professionally or relationally, that oftentimes we envy other people's relationships, and sometimes we'll do some diabolical things in order to secure those relationships for ourselves. Invariably, when we get there, we'll find out that it's not what we thought, that it wouldn't satisfy. So that basically, what do you want to do in your life? You want to be in the place where God has placed you. And you need to trust that God is putting you where he wants you to be. It's selfish ambition that always wants to move myself up the ladder to a higher and higher position. Years ago, there was a book called The Peter Principle, and the whole concept of the Peter Principle is that in life, you will eventually be promoted to a level of your own incompetence. It's kind of the idea of a guy who's a great salesman, and so they make him a sales manager. He knows how to sell, but he doesn't know how to manage. And so he fails as a sales manager because he doesn't know how to manage. And that's true in almost every arena of life. I've often said to God, don't promote me to a position that I'm not competent to fill. Please don't, because I want to be successful at what I'm doing. I don't want to be a failure at something I shouldn't be doing. And so that's where in the end you come to trust God. I belong to you, God. You're going to use my life the way you want to use it. What I experience is what you have for me. If it's not for me, then your will be done. I don't want that. Because I found that when I have been mispositioned, it's like an arm out of joint. You're suddenly in a place where you don't fit and you're not happy. But worst of all, what Paul says about these guys, that not only do they bring ruin to other people's lives, not only do they are they driven by greed and selfish ambition, but they are predatorial. He goes on to say, even as one of their own prophets has said, the Cretans, that's the people who live on Crete, are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons. And he said, this testimony is true. In other words, he comes back to this whole issue of what is their character like? And we all grow up in an environment that helps to shape and mold our character. He said the problem is that those who live in Crete are being shaped by factors that are really, really not healthy and good for you. Well, again, out of time. I'll continue this conversation as we pick it up tomorrow. Blessings.